and I completed a Juris Doctor in 2019 in Sydney, Australia. I'm an Australian admitted solicitor, and today I want to talk about what international opportunities are available for Australian lawyers once you've been admitted and had some experience in Australia as a lawyer. So let's go. I relocated to Dubai from Sydney in the end of 2021, and I continue to work here as an international lawyer. So I wanted to make this video for everybody that was asking me questions as to the best way to find international opportunities as an Australian lawyer, and what kind of practice areas should I be focusing on if I want to move overseas, or if I have plans to travel overseas and continue to work as a foreign lawyer. So I'd like to just break down some locations. I would like to talk about the kinds of practice areas that are the most transferable, and yeah, hopefully you'll find it helpful. And if you're considering an international move, it's certainly you're certainly not limited as an Australian lawyer, and there are opportunities out there. So first, there are so many different jurisdictions where you can actually transfer quite easily to. One of those being the UK. So a lot of Australian solicitors actually move to London or have an opportunity to work in London. They transfer with the firm that they're currently with, if it's an international firm that has a presence in the UK, and a lot of Australian firms and also international firms have presence in London, of course, and other parts of the UK. And I know a lot of Australian lawyers that have either relocated or done a couple of years in the UK and then moved back to Australia or moved somewhere else. So it's definitely an open market when it comes to practicing law in the UK as an Australian solicitor. You don't necessarily have to be admitted in the UK, but from what I understand, it's not super difficult to transition to become a UK admitted lawyer once you've received your Australian admission. And there are some courses and tests that you have to do, but it's not something that is out of reach. Another jurisdiction that's quite popular for Australian lawyers to be admitted in is the US jurisdiction. I know a lot of Australian lawyers that have dual admission in New York or California on top of being an Australian lawyer. And from what I understand, again, it is probably a bit more challenging than getting admitted in the UK. However, it's something that's doable with a bit of work, with a bit of study, and it really depends on what you want to do. I know an Australian solicitor that got admitted in New York and is now working as a foreign lawyer in Tokyo in Japan. There are people who have a US admissions and work here in Dubai. There are people that have US admissions and work in Hong Kong, for example. So it really depends on how much that's adding to what your practice area is, but definitely doable. There are solicitors that I know of who have made the move to New York and California, for example, with their admissions and everything, and are working there. So, I mean, there are a lot of great US firms out there that are looking for talented lawyers, and Australian lawyers have a good reputation. So that's another market that you could potentially move to from Australia. For a long time, a lot of Australian lawyers would go to Hong Kong, and most of the international firms that exist have an office in Hong Kong, and a lot of people I know have either lived and practiced law in Hong Kong, or lived there still, or went there as a graduate lawyer straight after university. So Hong Kong is still one of those places that you can go and practice law as an Australian lawyer, because a lot of the contracts and a lot of the agreements are still done under the UK law, and the UK law is very similar to Australian law because it's all common law jurisdictions. However, with the geopolitical shift, I think I've heard that many lawyers that have based themselves in Hong Kong have decided to move on to the UK, for example, or other jurisdictions, or potentially Singapore, and it's a personal choice and a preference. Hong Kong was something that I was considering as well at some point, but settled on Dubai in the end because of the different movements that were happening at the time that were mostly political and continue to happen. So in Asia, we would look at another market would be Singapore. I've done a lot of research when it comes to Singapore and the opportunities for lawyers in Singapore. Maybe 10 or so years ago, it was very easy for Australian lawyers to relocate to Singapore and work for international firms there. In the last 5 years or so, the market has tightened, and there's a lot of local talent that's graduating from local universities and doing really well. So it's quite difficult now for an expat lawyer, if you're not at a very senior position, to successfully relocate to Singapore and be kind of needed. It's best to train in a jurisdiction like Australia in a good firm, and then have multiple years under your belt so that you can demonstrate that you're building a practice. As a junior lawyer, I wouldn't recommend attempting to go to Singapore, because every recruiter that I spoke with, and then I spoke with a lot of partners in different law firms in Singapore, and that was the consensus, is that the last 5 years the market has really tightened, and the local talent, that's people that are born and bred in Singapore, and the talented lawyers coming out of the local universities are taking these positions in international law firms. So it's very difficult for expats to continue doing that in Singapore. Dubai is obviously an open market, and I chose to come to Dubai because I understood that there was a lot of more international opportunities, more international clients. There was an ability for me to use my languages because I speak Russian and French and Spanish, and this is a market where the East meets the West and things are happening, and it's a very dynamic place. And so for me, it was just something that I always wanted to experience, so it made sense from a personal perspective. From a lifestyle perspective, it's a bit challenging sometimes because it does get quite hot here, and you just have to weigh up the pros and cons for yourself. Dubai made sense for me, and so I came here. Other markets that I think are good might be the UK jurisdictions, but the islands that's such as the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands. There's also Bermuda, and you could go there as well as an Australian solicitor if you've got experience in particular in areas like litigation and insurance. Those islands actually have a lot of offices. A lot of international firms have offices there, and I know people that have successfully relocated to the Cayman Islands, for example, and so there is an opportunity to work as a lawyer there, and recruiters will definitely offer you those options. Other common law jurisdictions include New Zealand and Canada, for example. I don't know that many lawyers that move to New Zealand from Australia. It's usually the other way around. But a lot of the New Zealand lawyers that were coming over to Australia were able to work in Australia, and it's a vice versa situation. So you could easily transfer to New Zealand, and Canada is similar. I don't know the exact requirements to be admitted in Canada, but given it's another common law jurisdiction, I imagine that it's something that can be done. I had a lot of Canadians in my Juris Doctor degree in Sydney, and a lot of them went back to to Canada, and some remained in Australia, and so that's an exchange that continues to happen. If you speak any other languages, so if you're fluent in French or if you speak Spanish, you could potentially try and enter a different market. So say you wanted to be a lawyer in Paris. From what I understand though, it is quite challenging to practice law in a European jurisdiction without being admitted there. And the admission process can take years and years, and you have to have a master's, which in Australia usually we don't obtain. So Juris Doctor is actually not a master program, it's just a law degree, whereas a lot of my European friends who were with me in the law faculty in Oslo when I was doing my exchange, most of them had to complete a thesis, and that became part of their master's program, and only then were they able to be admitted in their relevant court's jurisdiction. So Italy, Spain, France, in Switzerland I think go through the similar process. And I think it's harder for Australian lawyers to establish themselves in a European jurisdiction than it is to go to an English-speaking country, and in particular common law jurisdictions. So next I wanted to touch on the kind of experience that will help you move overseas easier. On top of that list, I would put corporate law and finance, financial law. I think those are the most transferable skills. If you're an M&A lawyer, for example, it's the same doing an M&A deal in the US, in the UK, in Hong Kong, in Dubai, and so those skills are very, very transferable because you're doing transactions. And actually when you think about it, it's all of the transactional kind of elements of the role that are very transferable. So if you're doing banking law, all the contracts are pretty much the same on an international level. If you're doing IP law, data breach, security, IP contracts, all of that kind of experience is also very, very transferable and in high demand. So those skills are actually quite good in terms of if you're thinking, which areas should you be focusing on if you really want to relocate overseas eventually as an Australian lawyer. I did 3 seats. I started in restructuring, I went to real estate, and then went into disputes as my final seat, my final rotation as a trainee lawyer. I then transferred into the disputes team in Dubai. And in terms of disputes, and if you're doing litigation and regulatory work, it can be very localized, especially because you're going to the local Australian court, the federal court. But what you can transfer those skills to is international arbitration. And international arbitration is very international. And so when I moved to Dubai, I was doing international arbitration. My dispute skills definitely helped, and the fact that I was doing litigation and regulatory work as well. And then I pivoted into sanctions, investigations, and generally the world of compliance. And so that's something that I had to learn that was very new here with all of the sanctions that have been happening against Russia. However, all of my experience was transferable, and I was able to then continue working here as a foreign lawyer. But it's definitely limited. If you only have ever done litigation in Australia, I think it's a harder transition, and not every office, international office, will have litigation as kind of a part of the package. There'll be international disputes and international arbitration. So if you want to do litigation, try to do more of that international arbitration in Australia, and that will help you transition. In Dubai as well, there is a high demand for construction lawyers, so in terms of projects, that's a huge transferable skill as well, front end and then back end. So construction litigation is a huge thing because there's so much construction happening, and so those kinds of skills are very, very much in demand. So if you're a construction lawyer, you will definitely not have any issues transferring to places like Dubai. Other practice areas, such as tax, for example, that are very localized, that follow very stringent regulations when it comes to particular jurisdictions or even particular states in Australia, those skills I would say would be very challenging to transfer across, although I know tax lawyers in Dubai, for example, that have moved over from Europe, and tax lawyers that have moved over from Australia to London. So it's definitely possible. It just depends on, what kind of area of tax, and if you can demonstrate that you can successfully transfer the skills that you've obtained in Australia overseas, there shouldn't be too much. It's more about the longevity of time that you've spent practicing in a certain jurisdiction, and so if you've got 10 years of experience doing just Australian tax law, I think that's when it becomes much harder to transfer across and do something on an international level, because all your skills are with regards to the Australian tax system. Another one that will be very challenging to transfer across is criminal law, because it's very, very localized and very specific based on the penal code, based on the very system that's in place in terms of criminal prosecution and understanding the very specific cases and how the courts work. And so I think that might be a challenging one to transfer across. So I think, anything that's very, very localized in your jurisdiction or in your particular state, that will be a bit challenging. But never say never. And I mean, as long as you can prove that you can pivot the skills that you obtained and turn them into something else. So for example, if you're doing criminal investigations, you could potentially transfer into white-collar crime and say, an investigation is an investigation. You still conduct interviews, you still write reports, you still research legal principles, and you do that really well. So see where you can have the most transferable skills come into play and what that role requires. And at a junior level, I would say it doesn't matter what your experience has been so far. If you're 3-4 PQE associate, you can still pivot within that sphere and to try different things, and I've seen that happen a lot. So I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, I haven't done corporate law and that means that I could never go overseas. That is completely untrue. And so there are definitely opportunities for you to explore the world, explore what's out there. I hope that this video helps you think about your next steps and next options. And if you've got any questions, you can let me know in the comments. And as always, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because that gives me encouragement and also shows me that people are watching my content, and I will continue to make more helpful videos for junior and not so junior lawyers and law students to help guide in your careers. Thank you.